Hello everyone, this is Nick, how is everyone going? And welcome to a new recording space that I've started using. So me and my partner just moved to a new home about 1.5-ish months ago, and I actually have a nice large space for me to record in and do some actual on the table content. Yes, the white table is back. It's been in storage for far too long, so I'm looking forward to actually getting miniatures out and actually demonstrating things and maybe making some more like how to play videos, that kind of stuff. I wanted to make this video just discussing my thoughts about X-Wing as it's going, where the game's heading and how I feel about it in general. I realize in the last few videos discussing X-Wing, I've kind of hinted at a few of my thoughts, but I think it's just good to have one video where we sort of concentrate everything, talk about how AMG is going with, 2.5 and the new rule set, the new design ethos for the game, and just sort of flesh it out in one coherent video rather than just bring it up every now and then. Largely the reason I want to do this is because I'm getting a lot of negative comments about the new game, which is absolutely fine. I'm not having a go at anyone who strongly dislikes the game. But it seems to crop up every now and again in videos where I'm just discussing a new game element or something like that, and I just kind of want to encourage people to go, hey, I'm not actually involved with AMG myself, and we're not actually discussing the quality of X-Wing in that particular video, so I've actually had to politely ask a few commenters like, hey, I'm trying to cultivate a bit of positivity, actually like celebrate the game that we love, and you kind of just bringing the mood down. And if you're one of those commenters, by the way, I'm not having a go at anyone in particular, and I thank you for taking down that comment, because in all the situations, that's what happened. And I'm certainly not trying to, silence dissent. I think there's a lot of things to criticize about the way AMG is handling X-Wing right now, and I definitely want to discuss it. But yeah, I wanted to make one video where we can sort of have that conversation. So if you've been one of those commenters who have, not been engaging with my videos or, want to talk about this and want to actually bring up the things that you're concerned about with AMG, this is the video to do that in. I only ask you that if you're going to be critical of X-Wing and AMG in general, that you comment in a respectful way. There's no point having an attack at anyone. I'm not a shill for AMG. I just like talking about my favorite game on the internet. That's just who I am. That's just what I want to do. So I have a lot of things I like about 2.5, a lot of things I don't like about 2.5, and I just wanted to have like one sort of grand thesis video. All right, with that all out of the way, let's actually talk about X-Wing 2.5. Do I like X-Wing 2.5? As in, do I like the new rule set that AMG have put forward and implemented into the game? And I think for myself, the overall thesis statement for X-Wing 2.5, do I like it, is yes, I do like it. I think it is an excellent game. I am saying this in isolation of what X-Wing was before. I'm just looking at X-Wing 2.5, the rule set, 20-point squads, everything as it's written currently right now as the time of recording this in the rules. I like it a lot. I think the barrier of entry to X-Wing is very low right now. In certain ways, it is lower than it used to be. In certain ways, it is higher than it used to be. But in a vacuum, yes, I do like X-Wing 2.5. I don't love that we as a community have started calling it 2.5, because I think that makes a bit of needless confusion. I think, I don't know where this originally came from. I suspect a couple of specific YouTubers started using that language, and as a result, we started calling it X-Wing 2.5. Just to be clear to anyone new to the game who might be watching, there is no X-Wing 2.5. That's not a thing. It's just a colloquial term that we've started to call it. We're just playing X-Wing 2nd Edition with an updated rule set. You don't have to buy any extra content for 2.5. You don't go into a store and ask for 2.5. You go into a store and get X-Wing 2nd Edition content to play X-Wing 2nd Edition, and 2.5 is just a slightly changed rule set from what you get in most boxes right now. All right, next point. Do I think that X-Wing 2.5 was necessary? And I think ultimately this is my biggest criticism of AMG, Asmodee, or whoever decided to do and enact this new rule set. Because no, I do not believe that 2.5 was necessary, despite the fact that I just said that the barrier of entry is quite low on the new rule set of X-Wing. I don't think it was particularly high before. I think it's better in some ways, especially when it comes to things like tournament play, general player comprehension. It's very easy to sort of sit down and go, oh, okay, cool. This is the cards I have. This is the objectives I have. Bam, easy. I can just sort of point my ships in that direction and start going towards things. I know dogfighting in itself wasn't necessarily that complicated, but I think the accessibility and sort of like the guidance the new objectives offers to the game and actually gives new players is a good thing overall. And things like players not counting down the clock, something that I originally thought I would hate, but having actually tried X-Wing 2.5 now, the fact that you can sort of roughly ballpark in your head when a game is meant to end, but not know exactly when it's going to end is great. It's actually good to sort of not think about the clock as you're playing. Again, for a new player, even as an older player who, actually does pay attention to the meta and plays a bit more and actually, cares about it and gets a bit more competitive, that new system actually works great because it's one less thing that you're thinking about. It might be in the back of your mind. You might be trying to play to time, but it's much harder to do now. You're just not, popping one of your opponent's ship and then just running out the clock like you could in the older version of X-Wing. But getting back to whether I think this was necessary, the problem I have with it is X-Wing 2.0 was in such a good spot. I definitely think that X-Wing 2nd Edition, as in, back in 2018 or wherever it was, when we updated from X-Wing to X-Wing 2nd Edition, that was necessary. The game was heading in a direction where it was becoming more and more bloated. Power creep was a serious issue in 1st Edition, where newer and newer ships were just completely invalidating old ships. And because all the old ships were like the most iconic and the newer ones were like getting more and more fringe in terms of their connection to the canon, it became weird because these sort of no-name bounty hunters, like Dengar and the likes, became like the entire meta, which was weird. Because 2nd Edition has a system where you can adjust the points, it didn't have that power creep issue as much. I definitely think there's an argument to be made that yes, there were still some power creep issues. Definitely some complexity creep, I think, is something that was encroaching in 2nd Edition, and it probably is going to continue. I don't think 2.5's fixed that. But it was super necessary in 1st Edition to address that. And also, going from 1st to 2nd Edition, you could see that those original designers, when they were talking about it, and there was, a lot of transparency behind that transition, they were talking about their specific design ethos and moving forward by like having less dice insurance, having like rotatable arcs on all ships that could take turreted weapons. And you go through each of these things one by one, and nothing broke the design ethos of 1st Edition. It just felt like a better, more polished version of 1st Edition, whereas 2.5 is a ethos change, which is fine in itself because, after all, X-Wing moved to a new company. However, X-Wing wasn't in a terrible place to begin with, and that's the core problem I have with changing the core design philosophy. I don't think it was necessary, and you have to appreciate that no matter what, even if it's necessary or unnecessary, you are asking something of your fan base when you fundamentally change the rules of a game, and that can stress the fan base. We lost a lot of players in the transition from 1st Edition to 2nd Edition. We've lost arguably more players in the transition from 2nd Edition to 2.5. And, we'll recover in time. It's an excellent game. I think we'll be fine ultimately. But I think what I'm trying to say is when the game is ultimately already in an excellent place, can you really justify something that risks the fan base? You've got to have a pretty good reason to update the rule set, and I don't necessarily think that was the case. However, on that note, I do want to say that we do have a completely new design team for X-Wing, and I don't know if that was specifically AMG's choice. And I guess there's a philosophical conundrum. Do you force this new design team to just use the old design team's ethos if they don't necessarily agree with it? And I think the answer to that is they probably shouldn't. If you have a new design team and they're confident in their game-making ability, and I'm certainly confident AMG are very good at making games, they probably should just start designing the game in their own ethos. As long as it's a done in a way that doesn't ask too much of the fans. Yes, we have some subtle rule changes here and there, but the list building, and it's a measured thing. I don't know if AMG really considered how much they were changing the game. I don't know if they fully considered how much they're asking of the fans in this case. But at the end of the day, I think it's difficult to say we should just force a new design team to do everything the old design team did and just keep everything the same, even if they don't agree. What do I specifically not like about X-Wing 2.5? And I think there's a couple of key things here that's worth bringing up. The big one for me in terms of game design is the loss of granularity. We've gone from 200 points down to 20 points in terms of the way we build our lists. And on top of that, we no longer count upgrade cards as points towards that total. Now, every single pilot gets allocated a certain amount of upgrade card points, which in terms of balancing upgrade cards, that does present a bit of a challenge. I think that's fine in on itself, but overall, the loss of granularity can cause some game design issues, can potentially cause some balancing issues. Rather than try and speak vaguely and get my point across in a way that may be a bit cerebral and hard to understand, I'll use a specific example. I'm looking at some new scum lists myself. I'm going to be playing an X-Wing League over the coming months, and I was looking specifically at the Razor Crest and the new guild, the guild member pilot or whatever it's called. I'll have it up on the screen so you guys can see. Now, all of the Razor Crest pilots are worth 6 points. I think maybe some of them are 7 points, but there's not a lot of granularity between picking some of these as opposed to the other ones. And a lot of pilots seem to be suffering from this issue, where AMG are sort of, they're balancing these out by giving the more expensive pilots less upgrades as a way to sort of say, hey, you can have a better ability, but you're trading off some points there for upgrades. And that's cool. I don't have a problem with that. But this pilot is worth 6 points, for example, and I look at it and I try to balance out in a list, and 6 points is a very awkward place to be, especially for this pilot, because I want to try and field two of them together. That's worth 12 points alone. And I kind of look at this design and try to balance it out in my brain and think, is this pilot really better than 5 points? Maybe in testing, AMG just found that this pilot was too good to be 5 points. But is it really worth 6 points if that's the case? And this is the issue I have. Just because it's necessarily better than 5 point pilots, it really have to go all the way to 6 points. I know that it's only 1 point, but it's a 20th of the list. That in old school terms is 10 points more. Or if you're talking about X-Wing 1.0, that's 5 points more. And that, when I'm using sort of my monkey brain, my old school 2.0 and 1.0 brain, that seems like a lot, and that seems like a bit of a challenge when it comes to balancing things out. And yes, in the future, AMG could say, increase the ship cap to like 30 or 40 points to try and combat this, but then we're just sort of getting back in the same territory again. And, we're basically doing what FFG did from first edition to second edition, which is fine in on itself, but once again, when you change the rules that much, you're asking something of your fans. I don't think people will be very impressed if suddenly AMG decide to go from 20 points to 30 points tomorrow, even if it's good for the game. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm saying just change in itself can cause issues. I like change, but then again, I'm the kind of player that likes to really keep up with the game and sort of sink my teeth into how it works mechanically. And if for a newer player, that might be a bit more of a challenge, and I completely accept that. The other thing I'm not so keen on with 2.5 is the complexity of the ship upgrade combinations we currently have, because in 2.5, every pilot is allocated a certain amount of upgrade points, and that does not affect the overall squad total. You may as well fill up those points every single time. As a result, there is no incentive to taking fewer upgrades, and as a result, those ships generally become more complicated in the way they function within the game. I used to love taking Boba Fett with no upgrades, or maybe like one upgrade like Trick Shot or Fearless or something like that, because I found the more and more I didn't use upgrades, the more I just wanted to be ultra streamlined and efficient and maybe put those upgrades somewhere else in the list. I was very cutthroat with the way I designed lists. I would fly it, and especially if I took it to a tournament and something only activated once or twice or Never. I cut it out of my list. And I like how that affected the gameplay because it made things simpler. There was almost an incentive to not take upgrades beyond the fact that it would make your squad a little bit cheaper. The way things have worked with AMG, there's no incentive to do that, and it gives you more things to think about. And that actually does sort of, in that regard, raise the barrier of entry for new players and leads to more feel bads because everyone's running a whole heap of upgrades. And if you're the player that really practiced and really sort of nailed all your activations and all your upgrade cards, it can feel a little bit demoralizing as a new player. It's like, oh, that happened. Oh, you're re-rolling that dice? Oh, sorry, I forgot you had that upgrade card. And oh, you get to transfer. Yep, okay. And the more complicated things that's happening to a new player, the more they're inclined to disengage, which is, a pretty negative play experience. Now, on the flip side of all this, how do I think X-Wing 2.5 is an improvement over X-Wing 2nd Edition? And I've got a few things to say here, because I genuinely do think there are some big improvements. Number one, the scoring system. The scoring system is such an improvement over 2nd Edition. The 20-point structure that your squads now have now interact with the way you score with game objectives, which is really, really cool, the way they've balanced it out, the way you can sort of pick up beacons, the way that interacts with your ships. But the way you have two scoring systems, and this is dependent on which objective you're taking, but if you have half points by hitting half of your opponent's health down on one of their ships, you always get points for destroying your opponent's ship, no matter what objective you're taking. And the way that interacts with the objectives on the board, and the way that forces players to actually interact with the board, and not just, as I said before, nug one of your opponent's ship, then fly away, and then just sort of, run down the clock for the rest of the game. The objectives and the scoring is fantastic in 2.5, and I think it is a serious boon to the game. I think it's very easy for a new player to sort of go, oh, so what do these tokens do? Oh, well, you pick this up, and then that effect happens, and you get points. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I played a 2.5 tournament having learned none of the objectives. The first time I did it about 1 or 2 months ago now, I just sat there. Thankfully, all of my opponents were pretty savvy with 2.5 at that stage. I asked, oh, so what does that do? And they explained, I'm like, fine, that's easy. I really love the way the new point scoring works, and I think it's excellent. You're presented as a player with a couple of different ways to win the game and score points, and I think, frankly, that is fantastic. I think it is such a good idea for X-Wing. Actually, this sort of brings me on to the next topic I wanted to talk about, and that is the general assertion from some people that X-Wing is no longer a dogfighting game. I think this assertion is absolutely absurd. I'm seeing a few Facebook groups in particular basically repeat this over and over again like it's some kind of a meme. It's like, you're just doing objectives now and you're not actually dogfighting anymore. And I really want to challenge this belief because I don't believe it's the case. And to a certain extent, different objectives in X-Wing now do affect how much you are dogfighting, but all of them encourage you to actively engage your opponent's ships. All of them encourage you to not fortress, not run the clock down, not run away from your opponents. For the most part, there is arguably the objective where you have the beacon and you have to try and hold it for as long as possible. But even in that objective set, your ship is limited in what it can do. So your agency to run away from your opponents is actually lessened at the same time, which is great. It's such a good, simple concept. It's almost like, why did we never think of doing this stuff in X-Wing before? We're sort of leaning away from these negative play experiences where new players are just like, oh, okay, you do this, you do that. Like, you can clearly see on the board where your objectives is and where you need to use it. And look, even as a new player, you might not fully grasp that, but you're not sort of confronted by a bunch of really high-tier ace imperial nonsense, and it's really hard to track because it's all, based on what your opponent's doing. I don't have a problem with that style of play, and I think in the competitive scene, it's a lot of fun. I used to really be into that kind of stuff with X-Wing. I used to play a lot more competitively. The objective play, I think, is fantastic, and more to the point, does not detract from the dogfighting nature of this game. It, in fact, very much adds to it. There's one more thing I want to challenge as well. When AMG first pitched 2.5 and the general rule set surrounding X-Wing 2.5, they said something quite carelessly. And I understand as a player looking at what they said and going, well, they clearly don't know what they're talking about. And this was the assertion that as a new player in the old set of X-Wing, first edition, second edition, whatever, you didn't know necessarily what to do when you sat down to a table. And everyone's response was, oh, it's a dogfighting game. You blow up your opponent's ships. It's easy. The way I see it, with the new objectives that AMG have put into the game, there's a very clear delineation on the board, on the table in front of you, of what you need to do. There are literally things you need to pick up. There's literally zones you need to try and capture. All that kind of stuff. It's very clear to, as a new player, oh, I see there are beacons I have to pick up. I'll plant my ships in front of them and go straight for them. And that is a fine strategy. In actual fact, it's a very good strategy. As opposed to what X-Wing used to be like. Now, yes, I know the objectives are very, very clear, but there was a fundamental issue with the way the game operated. It was largely due to setup and the early activations in the game. As a new player, you have a few ships. You may be facing off against a very experienced player. Imagine them playing something like Scum or Imperial Aces, like a Palp Aces style list with your Sunterfell, your Omega Leader. I'm thinking first edition, but bear with me, it's still relevant to what we're talking about here. And they do a little funky setup where they put their Lambda shuttle in a corner and they point Sunterfell directly at it. And, they do their thing where Sunterfell bumps right into that Lambda shuttle in the first turn and they don't move and all that kind of stuff happens. And a new player may look at that and going, oh, I didn't. Okay, so you can just not move in the first turn and wait to see what I do. As a new player, but you come up with that kind of stuff, like do you just cluster all your ships towards that and just point them and try and shoot your opponent's ships? Do you try and have a ship off to the side? And you've got to think, as a new player, how do I combat this kind of stuff? And there's actually a lot of theory behind that. It's not actually that simple. Now, I found learning that a lot of fun. I don't think it's just a negative play experience. But to say it was easier than having clear delineation of objectives on the board, to say it was simpler to try and counteract against a high-tier ace list when you're a new player, I think is an absurd notion. Yes, I actually agree with AMG on this one. I actually think the game has become simpler in explaining to you naturally through the flow of the game what you should be doing as a new player. And again, I think that's fantastic. So yeah, I know this video was a bit of a rambly mess. I was just keen to sort of get all these thoughts out in the open. Again, I encourage people here to, in the comment section, talk about your experiences with X-Wing. Talk about your experience with 2.5. If you are one of these people that are just, commenting negatively on all my YouTube videos and all that kind of stuff and just saying AMG have ruined the game and all that kind of stuff, I just want to ask you something. Have you actually played 2.5? Legitimately. Because a trend I'm noticing, most people who have told me they hate what AMG are doing with it seem to do so immediately when a new piece of news come out. So there's no way they could have playtested it themselves. And most people I'm talking to actually quite like it and still have a healthy scene of X-Wing where they live, sort of have talked about this with a bit of measure. They've actually, waited a bit, they've tried it out and gone, oh, no, actually this is pretty good. And that was my own experience. I didn't want to sort of pile on AMG too much when this first happened, especially when the rules like random order after dice was announced. That was something that I really thought, this is not pushing the game in a good direction. But then when I came to try it, I realized, you know what, this isn't really the ultra random gameplay I thought it was going to be. It's actually fine. Like most things, I'm pleasantly surprised with how the game's going, and I'm sort of excited for the future. I do realize that the community has taken a bit of a hit. Now, the good thing about the eastern suburbs here in Melbourne, we do have some pretty dedicated players who have their own gaming clubs, and we actually are organising our own tournaments. If you happen to live in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, by the way, comment on the video, and if you want some games, let me know. We'll go hang out. It'd be awesome. But yeah, this overall shift, I think the main thing I want to say is you are entitled to think that the game is terrible now. It's a personal opinion. I'm not saying you're wrong for thinking that. I just want to encourage a lot of people that have jumped off the game without even trying it to give it a go, because I think it's such a shame to not give it a go, because the game is genuinely great. And if you're not going to give it a go, you're just depriving yourself needlessly. And that's kind of sad. Yeah, X-Wing 2.5 is genuinely great. And I think I want to keep talking about it. I want to keep being positive. I do want to move forward with the channel and actually start talking about some new games. It's something I've been toying with quite a lot. Now I have this new space. I can actually do a bit of like model making, talk about, mini games in general. I do have a couple of things behind me I definitely want to talk about in some future videos. But yeah, that's my main thing. You're entitled to not like X-Wing and the direction it's going in. But give it a go. I strongly recommend you give it a go. Alright, I've rambled for long enough. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know about your thoughts about the current state of X-Wing. We've also got a Patreon for the channel where you can actually support us monetarily each month. All of you who are involved with that, I cannot thank you enough. It genuinely means the world. It is the one thing that actually gives this channel somewhat of a semblance of an income. YouTube ad revenue is just woeful, and yes, I cannot thank you enough. With all that in mind, I'll catch everyone in the next video.